Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of MPE sound design for Surge XT. And today we will be looking at the very exciting and not at all scary or intimidating FM oscillators. As usual, we are doing this in the context of MIDI polyphonic expression. So I have my Linstrument here to play with. But the MPE is not going to be a big part of this video. So if you just want to sit here and learn something about frequency modulation, this should work out for you as well. So I'm going to start by quickly setting up Surge for MPE. I'll take LFO 1, switch it to the MSEG mode, edit the curve, right click, create minimal MSEG, build this S shape that I like. Disable the rate. Modulate the phase using MPE pressure, 99%. And this will serve as my response curve for my pressure control. We go to LFO 2 and do the same. Disable the rate. MSEG mode. Minimal MSEG. And this one today I'm just going to use a linear curve for this because that's going to make it easier to hear what we're doing with it. Modulate the phase using MPE timbre, 49%. Move this up to the middle. And that will make it a unipolar control, which will make more sense for working with FM. Okay, now that that's ready, I'm going to hop right on over to the FM2 oscillator mode. Now there's a lot of science and math that I'm going to be skipping here because in my experience that just serves to, with this topic, that just serves to confuse and intimidate. So we can learn about that stuff later, but right now I want to just get into how we can use it in Surge and develop some intuition for how FM synthesis works. Now we have a lot of different ways of doing FM in Surge, but today we're going to focus on the dedicated FM oscillators. So we're going to start with FM2, and then things will get more complicated. We'll go on to FM3. And maybe at the end, I will talk a little bit about the Sine Oscillator, which is also FM. They could call it FM1, but they don't. But I'm not going to have a whole lot to say about that one. So let's jump into FM2. Now what we have here is a very basic sine wave oscillator. I'm going to do one quick modulation. I'm going to turn down the volume here and then use my pressure curve to bring that back up. That'll give us a more natural sound. So we have this one basic sine wave, and this is called the carrier wave. And we also have two more oscillators, and those will be known as the modulators. So we're only going to hear the output of the carrier wave, which will have its frequency modulated by the modulators, which will give it different harmonics and different timbres. A quick note on terminology. So I have my carrier oscillator and my two modulator oscillators. And these are all oscillators, but in the world of FM, these are referred to as operators. So I have my oscillator number 1 in surge, which is made up of 3 operators. And I will try to stick to that terminology throughout this video, but I might slip up and call one of them an oscillator now and then. So let's ignore the second modulator for now, and also ignore the rest of this stuff. So we're just going to focus on these 2 parameters here with the M1 amount and the M1 ratio. M1 is the first modulator. So let's turn up the amount a little bit and see what happens to our waveform. Kind of bends a bit. And what the frequency modulation is doing is it's speeding up and slowing down our original waveform, which bends it into a different shape. And the more you do that, the more harmonics you bring out. And eventually it can start to get kind of nasty. And we can think of this amount as being analogous to the filter in analog subtractive synthesis, because our sound's going to get brighter and brighter the more we turn this up, as a low-pass filter would do. It is a rough analogy, but it can help us to get started. So I'm going to go take my MPE timbre curve and use that to modulate this a good bit, and hear what it sounds like when we play with it. Let's turn this up one more time so we can get a feel for the full amount. So the modulator amount is like a filter in that you get more harmonics, but it's actually creating more harmonics, whereas the filter would be letting through harmonics that were already there. And also the sound is a good bit different. And so if the amount is the filter in our analogy, then the ratio would be the basic waveform. So in subtractive synthesis, you have your saws, your squares, your sines, your triangles. And here we have numbers 1 through 32. And let's just see what happens to this waveform when we crank it up. We get something that's starting to look like a saw wave. And it's not exactly a saw wave, it's got this weird bump in it. And then it just gets crazier and crazier. But if I move the ratio to 2, we're going to get a bit of a different sound. And if we look at what that looks like, it becomes kind of squarish before it starts going crazy. And so the difference between 1 and 2 in the ratio is the 1 is saw-like in that it has both even and odd harmonics, whereas the 2 is square-like in having only the odd harmonics. And that pattern will continue as we move up to 3, which is again going to give us even and odd harmonics. And then 4 will only give us the odd harmonics. So this is 3. And this is 4. So the ratio, which is the frequency of the modulator relative to the frequency of the carrier. So if the carrier is playing 100 hertz, the modulator is going to be at 100 hertz, and then 200, 300, 400, and so on. So the odd numbered ratios get increasingly brighter, more piercing as you go up. And you can think of the odd numbered ratios as a family of saw-like waves, and the even numbered ratios as a family of increasingly piercing square-like waves. So if we crank this up to something like 9, here we get that really high overtone coming out. And pretty much anything beyond 8 is going to get us into this crystalline territory. Whereas the lower ratios are going to give us more of a naturalistic sound, maybe. And as we experiment with these different ratios, we can begin to get a feel for what each one is going to sound like, or what kind of thing each one is going to give us. And before we get into the Modulator 2, which is going to be the same, I want to jump down here to the feedback for a moment. So let me remove my timbre modulation on the M1 amount. Set both the amount and the ratio back to 0, or back to 1. I'm going to jump down here and look at the feedback for a minute. Let's see what happens when we play with this. Again, it's becoming saw-like. Now, what's happening with the feedback is our carrier wave is modulating itself. So the M1 and the M2 aren't involved here. This is just our initial sine wave modulating itself, but it's feeding back. So unlike an acoustic feedback, and this doesn't sound like acoustic feedback, the whole process is mathematically simultaneous, but we can think of it as an iterative process. So what happens is I start off modulating the sine wave by itself, and then I start to get something like this. But then the new wave is modulating the new wave. I hope that makes sense. So it's going to get increasingly warped because every iteration of the modulation is using new shapes based on the previous. And as we keep turning this up, it's going to get chaotic. And that's where we start to hear the noise come in. So in a sense, this is another version of the M1 or the M2 amount, but with that added feedback characteristic to it. This is another good thing to modulate. If I bring my timbre modulation on the M1 back, maybe I can add some pressure modulation to the feedback. And we can hear my sound is becoming more complex now. And we can also modulate this feedback negatively. It's going to give us a bit of a different sound. And here it's breaking into that chaos again. And also, we have different types of feedback here. So the default is surge, but then there's the vintage FM, which looks a lot the same, and it's going to sound a little bit different. And let's hear what this sounds like when we use the ratio of 2. I'm going to remove the feedback modulation for now. And let's see what happens when we bring in the second modulator. Now this one works just the same as the first. We're just going to be hearing them both now, and they're each going to have an effect on the carrier. I'm going to assign the M2 amount to the pressure. And let's bring the ratio up to 3. Yeah, we have a 2 and a 3. That should be neat. And I want to emphasize that this analogy is just an analogy because creating harmonics is not the same thing as filtering harmonics. And saw-like and square-like waves are not the same as saw and square waves. And it's going to sound different and it's going to behave differently than subtractive synthesis. But I just find it helps to have that mapping to those other concepts when you're just getting started. And you can experiment with combining these different ratios to see what the sounds feel like. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about envelopes a little bit. The classic FM synth, the Yamaha DX7, had a different envelope, maybe more than one, I don't remember right now. A different envelope for every operator, and it had 6 operators. So you combine these morphing shapes to get some interesting dynamics in your sound. That's not something I'm super interested in right now because I'm working with MPE and I want to control those dynamics with my hands. But we should try to see what happens when we create some plucks, because it can be pretty cool. So I'm going to take my LFO6 and I'm going to set that up to be an envelope. Crank down the sustain, crank down the decay, and deform it so that it is curved decay. I'm going to remove my pressure from modulating the second modulator, and I'm going to use this envelope to do it instead. And I'm going to add some velocity control, so I'll turn this amplitude down all the way. And then add modulation from velocity, 99%. Give it a little more decay and a little amplitude to start with. There we go. So these envelopes can add a lot of character to the sound and get you some of those classic DX7 tones. And if I crank up the amount of this envelope, we can hear a characteristic FM sound. Sort of a grit to that attack there. And this is something that happens at higher modulation amounts. And so once you start moving beyond the kind of clean sine wave sound of the FM, it can start to feel like certain materials. And I don't know what to call this one. Let's see what happens when I shorten this decay. And so I would characterize the FM as like a range of materials. Goes from sort of growly to woody to toad-like to plastic. No, rubber. Rubber comes before plastic, and then eventually it gets more metallic, and then it gets shrieky and noisy. And these different sounds all kind of exist on a spectrum, and they characterize the FM sound to me. And we'll hear some more of that as we get into FM3. But you should also be starting to hear some of the different possibilities we can get with this technique. And before we move on to the very exciting FM3 oscillator, I'm just going to take a second to show you a couple sounds I made with FM2. So here we have a little kalimba or thumb piano. And here I've got M1 has a ratio of 10, M2 a ratio of 1, and I'm using the filter envelope to modulate the amount of M1, and that's what's giving us that click at the beginning. And when we play low, we can hear some really nice bass in this sound. And FM is really good at that felt bass kind of thing. And you can hear down here we're getting into kick drum territory. I see there is no M2 amount. So this is all just using the M1. So I might experiment in the future with making some FM drums with this. Because I'm thinking just from the sound of this kick, we could probably do some pretty cool things. Next up, I have a guitar sort of thing. And our M1 ratio here is 3, and M2 is 7, and we've got a bit more of M1 than of M2. And I have an envelope on the M2 amount to make that little pluck, and a different envelope on the M1 amount to make another part of the pluck. And one more So it's quite nice at these mellow sounds. And it also has kind of there's a different sound to it than you get trying to do the same sort of thing with subtractive synthesis. And my ratios here are 1 and 2. And the M2 amount is modulated with the pressure and 1 with the timbre. And I'm also modulating this M1-2 offset with the timbre. I haven't talked about these yet. These are fairly subtle, these two parameters. So this first one is just going to detune the two modulators a little bit. Which used in moderation can give you a sort of a bit of a chorus effect. And the other one's the phase. That's just going to give the oscillators different phases. It's going to be pretty subtle most of the time, but you can use that. Just give it a random modulation. So each note will come out a little different. Again, it's going to be pretty subtle. And now I think we're ready to move on to FM3, where things start to get interesting. 40 minutes into the video. So FM3. Now there are a couple differences here. First, we lose those two parameters I just talked about, the offset and the phase. But that's not a big deal. We do have a third modulator now, M3. And this is a little different than the other two. This is a fixed frequency oscillator, so it won't pitch track like the others do, which kind of limits its utility to being more of an effect. But the big difference with FM3 is our ratios are now available for modulation, and also they are not confined to integers. And so using whole number ratio integers in FM2 made sure that all our operators were syncing up, and we always had a clean harmonic tone. But that's not the case anymore. So if I turn up my M1 amount a little bit, and again, we'll focus on one of these at a time. See that I start to get some weird shapes in between the integers. So now I don't have to start on 1. I can start with a 0.25, let's say. Or a 0.5. Bring this up to 1. and it will be just the same as it was in FM2. Let's try something like 1.11. And now we've got a pretty inharmonic tone. Got some grittiness to it. Starting to get growly on the low end. Now you'll notice if you look down here at my tuner, so here I've got no amount, and I'm playing a D. Now that we've got these inharmonic tones coming in, my tuner can no longer recognize the note. So you might find working with these sounds that you have to use your pitch control here to get yourself back in tune from time to time. Now I find that this inharmonicity can be a little more controlled if we stick to ratios that are not whole numbers, but are simple fractions like 1/4, 1/3, 1/2. So my ratio here is 1.5. And my tuner knows what note it is again. So those ratios are going to be they're going to be tamer than some of the others. And when I'm working with this, I try to be kind of very careful and precise with the ratio, because a little change makes a big difference. Now we're getting some of these frog/toad tones. And these are really the kind of sounds that I most often would want to use FM for, because subtractive synthesis has trouble creating these inharmonic tones, and you usually have to use some FM anyways, or just have your oscillators very detuned. And FM pulls this off much more easily. And you probably noticed we're getting into sort of a metallic bell sort of territory. If I crank up my release a bit, and we put some attack on this M1 amount. I'm getting into some xylophone or marimba kind of things. Let's give it a little initial amount so that it won't get completely clean after the decay. I'm going to turn off the pitch tracking on the instrument to make this a little more bell-like. Now, so we have access to bells that were very easy to make, and we've got a huge variety of different bell sounds that we can get now because of all this range we have in the operator. You can hear some of that rubberiness I was talking about in these low bells. Again, that's characteristic of the FM sound. So let's bring in Modulator 2. And let's give it a different envelope. Longer decay. And we're going to modulate the amount somewhat less. Bring down the ratio. Give this some feedback. So yeah, we can get into some pretty ugly and nasty sounds here. And if we want to make it a little nicer, let's play with these ratios. Give this one a 3.5. And let's give this one a 7. Now we can hear the feedback really acting as a distortion. So I'll just soften that up a bit. Just for fun, let's see what happens when I use my timbre to modulate one of these ratios. Just a little bit. That's interesting. It's probably not something I would do too often. More likely, I would use one of these envelopes to modulate the ratio. Yeah, you can have a lot of fun with these things. Most of the time, I would think I would probably not modulate the ratio. I'm going to turn down these amounts. So see, we don't have to let it get completely out of control. And get some dragon purring going on. Now let's look at this third modulator. And again, this one has a fixed frequency. It's not going to track the pitch. So it is tuned to 440 hertz, which is the A. And what it's doing is it's throwing the pitch off of everything, which is why I consider it not super useful. But in lesser amounts, you can add just kind of a little bit of a droniness to it, kind of like it's the body of your guitar, which is always going to resonate at the same frequency, regardless of what note you're playing. And if we crank it down really far, its lowest frequency is 13 Hertz, which is going to be a little fast for a vibrato. We bring the other guys back in. You can see this is just, it's another way to add some more chaos to already chaotic sounds. Let's try putting an LFO on this. So as you can see, if we don't care whether our sound sounds nice, we have practically infinite possibilities we can get out of this oscillator. If we do care that it sounds nice, well, it's always helpful to turn down the amounts. So that's going to be very useful for your solo noise drone project or any industrial bands you're involved with. So you might have noticed that I haven't tried very hard to show you how to make any specific sound. FM synthesis is actually quite good at mimicking acoustic sounds, but we're a little limited in surge because we only have kind of 3.5 operators, whereas like the DX7 had 6 operators. And the idea is that with 6 operators, you have sufficient combinations of amounts and ratios to generate a vast variety of distinct timbres. And this is the power of FM synthesis, but it's inextricably linked with the difficulty because there's just so much going on. It's hard to keep track of who's doing what. And I don't do it a lot because there's just always an easier way, usually a wavetable, to get the timbre I'm looking for. But when I am trying to build a sound with FM, if I have a particular sound in mind, I will try to keep it as simple as possible and use as few operators as I can. And then start bringing in more as I need them. Like if there's a little quirk that there's extra harmonics in the mid-range, then I'll maybe bring in another operator and choose either the even or the odd ratio as is appropriate, and then bring that one up enough until it accomplishes that mid-range boost I'm looking for. That sort of thing. But you can go crazy with it, and you might enjoy going crazy with it, so don't rule it out. So mostly when I'm using FM, it's because I like the sound of FM, or I'm looking for a bell or some other inharmonic sound that it does much better than other methods do. However, I do want to point out that we don't need to be quite so limited to our 3.5 operators. I'm counting the M3 as a half because it doesn't track. But if you look up here in our oscillator FM routing, we do have our FM depth parameter. And 2-to-1 or 3-to-2-to-1 or 2 + 1 + 3. We can bring in more FM from other oscillators. So if I take this one back to FM2, and then I set up second oscillator as FM2, and my third oscillator as FM2, I don't have to listen to these other two oscillators, so I'm going to keep them muted, but they will modulate oscillator 1. And I'm just going to set some amounts and ratios here. So my point here is if you do want to explore the complex depths of FM, you do not necessarily need to buy a new synthesizer. We do have more available to us here. Such a 3-to-2-to-1 and so now I have a 9-operator FM synthesizer. Now it's still going to be somewhat limited compared to other synths because there's this thing called algorithms, which is sometimes your modulators are modulating your carrier, but sometimes they're modulating other modulators, and you have different parallel lines, and I'll show you a picture. And we have all these different algorithm configurations that we can use for different sounds. And those are not really available to us in Surge. So there is plenty more to explore. I just wanted to give you a quick start guide to FM inside Surge. And about at the end here, I'm going to go back. Let's turn this FM depth down. Back to oscillator 1. I'm just going to show you the Sine Oscillator really quickly, because this one is also an FM oscillator. It doesn't have the modulators, it just modulates itself using the feedback parameter. as we discussed earlier. And our positive feedback here, it sounds to me, that's going to give us our saw-like waves. Whereas the negative feedback is going to give us our square-like waves. And we've also got a couple filters here that are disabled by default. I'm not going to bother talking about them. They're just filters. High pass and low pass, although annoyingly called low cut and high cut. And then we have unison mode. Which the other oscillators, the other FM oscillators don't have, which is a little annoying because I think they don't have it just because there wasn't enough space in this little window. Because it could be nice to have a unison mode. But the other interesting thing about this oscillator is we don't have just this basic sine wave shape. We've got a bunch of permutations of a basic sine wave shape. There's just a lot of different math they did to transform the sine. And how I would use this one is mostly I would use it in subtractive synthesis and treat it as the source of an extra 28 wave shapes that I can use. But it is there. It is pretty cool. All right, I think that's it. I will see you again sometime in the future. All right, enjoy making your nasty, nasty FM sounds.